So good evening, and welcome to everybody coming out on this Wednesday night for our second book talk of the semester. I'm Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I'll start off just by mentioning a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock, we have our first Stanford visiting professor lecture of the year. This was postponed from last Thursday, and it's a discussion with the author Valeria Luiselli. So I hope you can all come back tomorrow night. And then on Wednesday, October 27th, again at 8 o'clock, we'll have our third book talk with Alison Schifani. We'll be talking about urban ecology and intervention in the 21st century Americas, verticality, catastrophe, and the mediated city. Now, a lot of you have been to these book talks before, but I'll just give a word or two about how things work. If you have any question at any point, you can type your question into the question and answer box. And then when it comes time for questioning, I'll be reading them out, and you can always ask follow-up questions then and so forth. So that's how you can ask questions in this webinar format. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague in religious studies, Justin Britzinger, who will introduce our speaker for the evening, Robyn Walsh. Thanks, Justin.
Good evening. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Robyn Walsh, Associate Professor of Religious Studies here at UM. Dr. Walsh came to us after completing graduate work at Harvard and Brown and has distinguished herself as a productive and innovative scholar, as well as an outstanding teacher. She has published research articles in top-tier journals, including Classical Quarterly and Jewish Studies, as well as various edited volumes, on topics ranging from the Gospels and Roman satire, and the Gospels as imperial captive literature, to a Jewish archaeological site in Spain, and the stereotype of religion as, quote unquote, a private matter. She has also written public-facing scholarship for popular venues such as Slate, Huffington Post, and the Daily Beast, and is helping to shape the direction of her field as a series editor for New Directions in Gospel Literature and area director for the Database of Religious History. Today, she will be talking to us about her recently published monograph, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. This is a groundbreaking work of scholarship that challenges our understanding not just of what the Gospels say, but what they are and how they should be read, transforming our understanding of how Christianity began. Like any iconoclastic work, it is not without controversy, yet whether they agree or not, scholars in the field will have to reckon with a book that one reader described as, quote, perhaps the most important book on the origin of the Gospels since Rudolf Bultmann's History of the Synoptic Traditions, quote unquote. And to save you the Google, that was published in 1921. So that is the most important book in a century. With no further ado, I will hand it over to my talented colleague, Robyn Walsh, to tell us all about it.
Thank you so much, Justin, for that introduction. It was incredibly generous, and thank you to Hugh and the Humanities Center for giving me this opportunity to showcase my work and to talk to colleagues and everyone at large about what I'm working on. And I actually did not know about that quote, which I suspect was taken from something I'm not supposed to know about, but I'm very flattered by it. So thank you very much for that. The way I'm going to structure my time today is, I was just saying to Dr. Thomas that I'm going to live a little dangerously. And rather than read from the book itself, I want to speak extemporaneously about the book and some of the major aspects of the book, but also about my field at large and how I see the book interacting with my field or engaging with my field. So I've put together a little bit of a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can share this. Is it coming up? Okay, and you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect, okay. So one thing I want to do is with a book talk, you have the opportunity to give a little bit of an insight and talk to the author about some of the aspects that go into putting a book together. So I've taken the liberty here of actually showing you the image that I wanted for the book, but I couldn't get the rights for. So I had to instead go with here. Let me see here. Go with this. So this is the cover of the book, which is not too shabby. I don't think. I think it turned out all right. And actually, there is some symbolism that this cover captures that the other cover did not, that I can talk about maybe as a bookend to this talk. The other thing that I wanted to foreground in showing you this cover and talking a little bit about the behind the scenes making of this particular monograph is that this was not the title either that I originally wanted. It's not what I titled the manuscript that I submitted to the press. The title was The Beginnings of Early Christian Literature. And I was trying to, at the time, avoid the term origins. For various reasons, the press wanted the word origin really just for searching purposes for anyone looking for this book or looking for this topic, because the word is so predominant in our field, because people are often trying to locate the origins of the early Christian movement, or what we call Christianity, what in the first century was more often scholars refer to as the Jesus movement, and to try to find out more about the historical Jesus and the early Christians themselves. Now, I was able to actually use this title to my advantage because I was able to talk more about why I felt that that concept of origins doesn't really work for our field or is problematic. And that's something that will come out in what I talk about and what follows. What I want to do today, this is from the table of contents of the book, is talk a little bit more about what I do in chapters 1 and 2. And as with most books, chapter 1, The Myth of Christian Origins, is what I've titled it. It talks about the field. It talks about some of my theoretical assumptions going into this work, but also what I saw as lacunae in the field that I wanted to fill with my own interpretive work. And so I will talk more about that in a moment, but also about how I thought our field had gotten to a point where our concern for origins and our primary concern with that earliest stage of Christianity had gone a little bit off track. And so there I talk about the Romantic movement, particularly in Germany and the 18th and 19th century. So let me review that with you today to some extent. So as you saw, my first chapter I titled The Myth of Christian Origins, and I've published on this elsewhere. And this is one piece that I wrote that appeared in another volume, but I wanted to show to you here because of its title. I'm talking here about a source called Q itself from Quelle in German, meaning source, that is hypothesized by early Christian scholars as perhaps one of the documents that was being used by the early Christian authors of the canonical Gospels to help them reconstruct the sayings and teachings of the historical Jesus. But again, entirely hypothetical. But I thought emblematic of a larger trend within the field that I've termed, and I'm not the first to do this, but I collated a bunch of different theories and scholars together who have also talked about the Big Bang theory of Christian origins, namely that Jesus is born at a certain point. He starts his ministry, we might call ministry or teaching activity, miracle working, and boom, people automatically just follow him. And then after his death, someone like Paul comes along, understands Jesus to be a Messiah figure, a Christ figure, and boom, people just automatically, the word we might use in English, convert to what either Jesus or Paul were advocating for or teaching in terms of what we might call an early Christian movement or the central tenets of Christianity and that theology. So some of the presumptions in that kind of Big Bang are that something like conversion was immediate, that it was uncontested, that Christianity itself was in its earliest stages cohesive, and that it was also widespread. And this is a narrative of Christian origins that is affirmed by sources like the Acts of the Apostles it's written in the 2nd century, so later, several generations later than the period in question, but one in which you have 5,000 people converted in one day. So this idea, again, Big Bang kind of captures the idea that there's an origin, some kind of genesis, and then, no pun intended, genesis, and then boom. It's wildly cohesive and coherent, and conversion happens without question in an immediate sense. But if you look at the timeline for early Christianity and the development of these documents, that doesn't quite match this Big Bang theory of Christian origins, doesn't quite match what our evidence gives us. So Jesus dies, to the best of our knowledge, around 30. And I can talk about the problems with these dates to some extent because of changes in the calendar. And then the man we know as Paul the Apostle has an experience that he describes in his letters that turns him to advocating for Jesus Christ as the Jewish Messiah. Paul himself is Jewish. He's a Pharisee, which means he's a teacher of Jewish scripture and an interpreter of Jewish scripture. And he understands Jesus to have been a predicted Jewish Messiah. But Paul himself actually never knew the historical Jesus. He never met him, and that's not contested. We know this from his letters, and to the extent that we can treat the Gospels or any other source as historical, we know that their paths never crossed during Jesus's lifetime. Paul's writing at a time when there are other Jewish authors in the diaspora of the ancient Mediterranean world, also writing in Greek, also interpreting Jewish scripture, like Philo and Josephus. So this is common practice for a Jewish person in antiquity in the ancient Mediterranean to be writing in Greek, interpreting Jewish scripture with a Gentile audience in mind. What we might call Paul's ministry goes from about 50 to 60. As best we can tell, tradition tells us Paul dies somewhere around 60 to 65 CE, although we don't actually know what happens to him. His letters just stop and he sort of falls off the historical map. Then the Jewish war takes place in 70 CE, is when it takes place from about 68 to 73, but the Jewish temple in Jerusalem falls in 70. So we mark that as an important date because that's when we believe the first gospels, the canonical gospels, start to be written, is after the fall of that temple. So notice you have a big gap, especially with life expectancy being as low as it is in antiquity between Jesus's death and that war, and when the Gospels, which are supposed to be chronicling the life of this historical Jesus figure, are written down. Now, Paul's particularly interesting, and I won't be able to talk much about him today, although I talk about him in the book, but I should note, again, Paul never knew Jesus personally. The man, he hardly speaks about Jesus as a historical person other than a few teachings. Anything that he tells us about Jesus the man or his life, actually he describes as coming to him in divination experiences of the risen Christ telling him what he did. So the chronicle of what we traditionally call the Last Supper or the Lord's Supper, Paul talks about it in his letters, but he describes it as the Lord appeared to me basically in a dream and told me what he did that night. So what Paul tells us about those events are things that he had a divination experience about. He has no personal knowledge of, and he's not attributing to anybody who may have been there. So he's not receiving this from an eyewitness. Paul believes he saw and continues to encounter the risen Christ, this predicted Jewish messianic figure who was in life Jesus of Nazareth. But to Paul, he's very much concerned with the man he calls Christ. Often he even in Greek says Christ Jesus rather than Jesus Christ, which we're used to in English. So the important thing to him is that the Christ, the risen Christ, this messianic figure has been appearing to him and proving to him that the scenarios that have been promised through the covenants of the Jewish God to his people are being fulfilled. Paul travels around the Eastern Mediterranean and he offers his expertise as a Pharisee, again, a literate religious specialist, a Jewish interpreter of scripture, and saying that he's encountered this Jewish Messiah and explaining his authorized account of what's going on with this predicted return of Christ to earth. And the groups to whom Paul writes, he's sort of variously successful. So I wanted to bring up Paul in part because of this idea of the Big Bang theory. You'll often hear about Pauline churches or Pauline communities and debates about, why were they infighting or, how are they coalescing? when really the problem appears to be in these letters that people are not immediately big bang converting to Paul's ideas. Some groups like the Galatians more or less seem to agree with Paul, although he's also angry with them because some of them are circumcising on the advice of other people who believe the early Jesus movement to be an exclusively Jewish movement. So any Gentiles, non-Jews who want to join the movement should follow the Jewish law, including circumcision. He's angry about that, but otherwise they more or less get along. He gets along with the Philippians. They seem to be a fairly cohesive group. But some groups like the Corinthians, he never quite has under his control. They never quite coalesce in a firm way that social scientists would see as wholly collective. And some, like the Romans, he never even met. He writes his letter to the Romans telling them that he's heard there's a Jesus group already there and he'd like them to pay for him to come see them and then possibly sponsor him to go on to Spain. So actually at the time of that letter, it's really like his intellectual CV. He hasn't actually met the Romans yet. So the idea that even the Romans are his church is a bit of a misnomer. And often when he says, you are the Galatians or you are the Romans in his letters, he's what I say here, invokes to evoke. He's trying to get them to coalesce by using that kind of language, even if it's not actually what seems to be happening on the ground if you read between the lines of his letters. So if Paul never knew Jesus and he's only communicating what he's learned through divination experiences, and even these early Christian groups are maybe not as cohesive as tradition would have us imagine, how do we know anything about the historical Jesus as it comes down to us in the Gospels? Well, the strategy that often is put forth in the field is that there must have been an oral tradition that persisted from generation to generation, communicated verbally from those who were the immediate followers of Jesus to those who later on joined the group. So by this strategy, Jesus would have taught around the Galilee and then headed to Jerusalem. He experiences an execution at the hands of the Romans for being what's more or less an insurrectionist, sometimes a blasphemer. Depends on which gospel you're looking at. There are different charges, sometimes the same charge. And then a couple of generations later, these gospel writers hear these oral traditions and document them, write them down. And often this oral tradition is understood to be what's being passed by certain communities, certain churches, maybe not Pauline churches, but other churches throughout the Mediterranean that again are understood to be cohesive, understood to be collecting these traditions, holding on to them, and then trying to find a spokesperson to record them for posterity, particularly after that war. So on one hand, this makes sense as a theory, the oral tradition theory, in particular because if you take the Gospels as historical, at least in some measure, Jesus's followers are not literate. He chooses his followers among really what's a peasant class in antiquity, including fishermen. These people that he has following him and the people that he ministers to in the Galilee and throughout Judea, they are largely not only illiterate, but they're speaking Aramaic. They may not be able to read and write, but they are speaking Aramaic. And then that becomes a problem just to foreground because the gospel writers are writing in Greek. And then also it's highly local. So Jesus doesn't actually cover that much geographic territory in his time. He's in the Galilee, he goes to Jerusalem, but anybody who heard him, it would have been a fairly small group, relatively speaking. So essentially oral tradition is a bit like a game of telephone with a mix of maybe lost in translation somewhere in there until you actually get these gospels written again, several generations, possibly after Jesus, depending on life expectancy, Jesus lived and died. So already you can see that this is a bit of a stretch, you might say, oral tradition for guaranteeing that what you're reading in the Gospels is historical. Because it would be a little bit like us writing about World War II or Elvis or the Bee Gees or the Beatles for the first time now. So relying on oral tradition to write those things down now. And I'm not trying to dismiss oral tradition altogether. I can recite for you almost any Beatles song that exists. But what we have from Jesus is not in verse. And what we have as in terms of Jesus's teachings in the Gospels are often found elsewhere throughout ancient Mediterranean literature. including some of the stories about his healings and other stories that we find in the Gospels, which suggests that maybe it's not oral tradition that's the main driver of what we find as the content in the canonical Gospels, but maybe something else. And then the other thing to note is that in classics and other fields that study ancient literature, ancient Mediterranean literature, the idea of oral tradition isn't treated in the same way as it is in the field of New Testament studies. Namely, it's not considered such a slam dunk theory. And there are some, you can argue, exceptions to this, possibly Homer or Aesop. There's a recent book that the author won the MacArthur for, that talks a little bit about how some of the characterizations and teachings of a figure like Aesop may have been part of oral tradition. And again, I'm not disputing that oral tradition may be a factor, but in all of those cases, it's not understood that something being recorded is representing some kind of group mentality. And so that's really an idiosyncratic approach of New Testament studies, to think that what we find in the Gospels was something written by a spokesperson on behalf of a community, reflecting an oral tradition that's been passed down over generations. So if the field of New Testament studies is really the only field that is advocating for the oral tradition theory in such a concerted way, or relying on it so much as a pillar for how it interprets the Gospels and the historicity of the Gospels, why is it treating the Gospels differently than we would treat other ancient authors and other ancient texts? And so this brought me to the second point, or the second chapter of my book. And I went back to the Romantic movement, primarily again in Germany, although I considered the Romantic movement elsewhere in continental Europe and England from the 18th and 19th centuries. And the reason I went back to the Romantic movement, there are many reasons, and I'll go through them, but in part, the primary reason is that the origins of the field of New Testament studies really go back to Germany and the founding of the academy around that period. And I'll come back to that, but also some of the tenets of the Romantic movement, and particularly the way the Romantic movement approached texts and ancient texts at times, seem to have some resonances with what I've just described as that early Christian Big Bang. The Romantic movement, and this is again in broad strokes, and we can talk maybe in the Q&A more about some of the gradations of this, but some of the main tenets of Romanticism when it came to reading texts included looking for origins, looking for the lost language of the folk of a particular people, and that was tied quite a bit with nationalism and political nationalism at the time, trying to reassert ideas of community, which also had to do with political interests of the era, and also trying to retrieve the language of what they called the poet or the genius author, the figures who through their music, through their poetry, or through their writing really encapsulate the spirit, they often use the word spirit, the Geist, of a particular folk or people. And so one of the predominant examples that people may be familiar with is Shakespeare. So Shakespeare was understood to not only encapsulate the Elizabethan movement, but also the language, the interest, the stories of the, I think the word that was often used, so pardon me, is low-lived Elizabethan. So more of that peasant class Elizabethan who was interested in these stories, these narratives, and that he's capturing the language, the interest, the spirit of those people. So even the Germans heralded Shakespeare as one of the great poets, author geniuses of the Romantic movement. I think you can already probably see again with these categories how what I'm saying mirrors quite a bit the traditional approach of the New Testament studies to the gospel, the canonical gospel texts. The other example that I can give you that I think quite helps with thinking about how the Romantic movement functioned and its relationship to early Christianity are the Grimm brothers. Now, while the Grimm brothers themselves did not work on the New Testament, they are emblematic of, again, exactly this approach, the idea that they could find the oral traditions, the stories of the folk of their era. And the Grimm brothers themselves were quite wealthy. They were more or less sort of gentlemen academics. They didn't quite have the credentials to do all the work that they were doing, but they had the social and cultural capital to do it. And they also had the financing to do it, but a deep dive into their methods demonstrate not so much that they were retrieving the oral traditions of the German people as much as sort of cobbling together things that they had heard from, say, those who worked in their household, more so than actually going out and doing some of the work that we imagine they might have been doing, gathering these stories. So they're elite, but they're also kind of relying on pre-existing literature as a scaffolding for the different stories that they put together. The other thing going on, back to political nationalism or political interest to some extent, again, particularly in Germany, is the idea of a Protestant Catholic divide within Europe during the Romantic movement that in particular saw Rome, represented in this period by the Pope, as very decadent and indulgent and hearkening back to the worst excesses of quote unquote pagan Rome. So if you understand that, it becomes quite difficult to imagine that early Christians could be anything like that. They couldn't possibly be part of that Roman elite. They would be more akin to the folk than to the excesses of, say, the Roman emperor, who in the imagination of this period, again, the Protestant imagination, was more akin to the Roman emperors than the common people. And as I mentioned, the field of New Testament studies principally came out of the academy in Germany of the Romantic period, when also there were not the same divisions within the field or within the guild that we have now. So somebody working in ancient studies or the critical study of ancient texts could, on one hand, be working on ancient German texts and then do an interpretation of the New Testament and then work, say, on Homer, and it was not a problem. The strict divisions we have in the field did not obtain for this particular era in the academy. Eventually, you get departments like classics, philosophy, religion divided more distinctly, but you don't have it in this period. And so I only point that out to say there's a way in which the trajectory of the fields, they begin to diverge. But my case that I make in that chapter is that New Testament, early Christian studies really stays within the channel that continues to champion the folk and the author genius as a representative writer of the folk in a way that, say, classics does not. So moving on, one way that I hope all of this can really come together and seem like I'm not just kind of pulling at comparanda that may not actually have a relationship. What I said before about decadent Rome and this idea that these early Christians couldn't have anything to do with those excesses of pagan Rome and those elites, that has something, I think, to do with Roman education, which is where the rest of the book goes, the direction that I go. So I mentioned to you before that there's an idea, well, the early Christians, they were probably very much like the early Christians depicted in the canonical Gospels, those early followers of Jesus. They are probably not well born. They're probably not of a more elite economic or social status. They probably are very much like those illiterate fishermen and others who were following Jesus. That idea persists primarily from the Gospels themselves, yet this agitates against what we know about ancient practices when it comes to writing and authorship and reading and any kind of literate practice related to those activities. To be able to read and write in the ancient world, you had to be fairly elite as far as social class or cultural capital and social capital, maybe not economic capital, because you could be an educated enslaved person in this period who has been educated by your owner to be able to do things for your household that involved literacy. So I want to be careful about that. It's not necessarily an economic scale, but Roman education was a very narrow field. To be educated in this period in which we know the Gospels are being written, you had to have access to the capital to be able to go through what was called paideia, which is what we call school, what we might call school. And it really took quite a bit to get to the point where you could write something like we see here. This is actually one of our earliest pieces of the New Testament. I believe it's from the Gospel of John. And to be able to just materially and practically have access to this kind of production, you would have had to go to school for years. Someone would have had to finance that. The best schools were and best teachers were known to be very urban, so in urban centers. And it took a lot of time an effort to get to the point where you could even write something at the literacy level as of the Gospels in Koine Greek. And so that really doesn't match up with the idea that these are just poor people who find a literate spokesperson. To be in that position, you really do need someone who has had quite a bit more education and access to various kinds of literature in the Greco-Roman world, broadly speaking, to be able to write this material. The reason I'm emphasizing that, and let me just go to my next slide, literate elite, highly educated, you had to be part of some kind of literate network to quote unquote publish your works. The reason I want to emphasize this is that we can see in the Gospels themselves evidence that the Gospel writers were very concerned about making sure that what they were writing conformed to certain genre expectations. And there are allusions throughout to other kinds of Greco-Roman literature that was popular at the time, including principally a lot of Middle Platonist works and other philosophical works. And as I argue in the book, I think there have been some pieces of comparenda that have been missed, including works that were from, again, broader Greco-Roman literature, including some of the Greek novels, and one in particular that I have in mind called the Satyricon, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But there seems to be a conversation going on between the Gospels, the Gospel authors, and literate Roman culture, not so much this idea of what we might call oral tradition. And we know this from the authors themselves. This is a preface to the Gospel of Luke, where he actually describes his process. He's the only one who goes to the length to actually talk about this, because he had a patron who paid for him, a wealthy patron who paid for him to write these stories down. And he describes his process as this. He says that many have sat down to write an orderly account of the events that were fulfilled among us. So he's referencing there what happened with the early Christians and Jesus during his lifetime. And he says they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he does claim, what, again, not trying to throw out oral tradition overall, but rhetorically, it's very important for him to claim that there are eyewitnesses. This is something that historiographers in the ancient world always do. They always want to claim that eyewitnesses helped fuel their accounts. And then he says, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you. So what he is describing is very much a literate practice, not just listening to the eyewitnesses. Of course, he's going to claim that he has eyewitnesses accounts. Again, historiographers always do this in the ancient world. But he's actually describing a very much, again, a literate practice where he is trying to collate a number of stories. And he admits in the beginning here that they've been set down, they've been written. He's reading other accounts and trying to put those all together into a story that he thinks is the closest thing to what actually happened. So this description, again, it's more of a traditional description of what we would understand an elite Roman literate producer to do in antiquity, again, rather than that kind of process that seems more like what the Grimm brothers are also trying to claim, trying to retrieve the oral tradition of the folk. So the book tries to then go on and say, if the gospel authors were not just recording oral tradition purely, were actually elite Roman authors engaged in broader literary culture, what is in their mind in terms of these social networks of literature, of genre expectation, of what they're even reading that we know they would have read in Paideia that may have made its way into these texts, what is in their mind when they're doing this work. So I try to interface with other literary evidence from the era to see if there were any parallels with other stories that are out in the ether that are still extant, that might give us some clue into how they are shaping their narrative, again, taking into account genre expectations for someone who had that kind of elite education. And as I mentioned, I looked at one compilation of stories in particular called the Satyricon. And there are people who argue the Satyricon is 1st century, 2nd century. I go through this in the book. It's more or less in that time frame that we think the canonical gospels are being written: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And so there's no big surprise. There's arguments you can make either way that this text is, again, in the ether at the time the gospels are being written. So whether or not you think that they are actually reading each other, or in which direction you think that's happening, to the extent that they represent stories that are, again, out in the world. They demonstrate that there are authors recording these stories in a variety of different genre classifications and a variety of different venues and interfacing with these narratives at the same time. So it's not exclusive to Christianity. And so I'll just give you a few examples. I'm breaking one of my own rules here. I usually don't try to put too much text on a slide. I know that's a no-no pedagogically, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of proof text to some of what I'm saying here. So I put a little bit extra text. But there's one dining scene in, actually, let me go back before I spill the beans on the Gospels. But there's one dining story in the Satyricon involving a man named Trimalchio, who is dining with his friends. He's taking on airs. He's actually not literate, but he has a very big library. And he likes to engage what you might call literate culture, even though he himself cannot write. And he has this big dinner party for his friends. And at one point, he starts to worry that he may perish. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a scene in which Jesus, before his death, says that his body will be anointed before its burial. And this happens right before that Lord's Supper I mentioned previously. Well, in the Satyricon, Trimalchio makes a very similar statement where he has this dinner party with his friends and he starts to worry that, he may be done in the next day because he's seeing a number of omens that are telling him that he thinks this may be the case. So he tells them that he wants them all imagined to his funeral, and he actually does take out ointment and starts to anoint himself before what he imagines is going to be his own death at this funerary meal. And then he starts talking about how he wants to leave his will and testament. And so he says, all those who are beneficiaries in my will, take what I've given only under the following condition, that you divide my body into parts and eat it in the presence of people. I advise my friends not to refuse what I order, but to eat my body with the same enthusiasm with which they have cursed my spirit. So not only does he anoint himself at the table and predicts his own death, but he does so by saying he wants to give out his testament that his friends should divide and eat his body after his death. So, here's one story where some of those themes, remain persistent. At the same dinner party, a cock crows before Trimalchio predicts his own death. This is also something that happens in the gospel. Jesus predicts Peter will deny him 3 times before the cock sounds twice before his crucifixion. Trimalchio says the same thing. He hears a cock crowing. And because this is a satire, when he hears it, he panics because he knows that's an omen of death, but he brings the chicken in and they cook it, so he's going to eat it to kind of head things off at the pass, as you would expect in a satire. But the idea of the rooster as a prognosticator of death, that does appear within Greco-Roman literature, and it's quite common. And to particularly have that in a scene in the Satyricon, where you have a man at a basically a Lord's Supper, you would have called it the same thing in this period, with his friends, anointing himself, predicting his death, asking them to divide his body as his testament, hearing a cock crow. So you see why I would lean on this story as one particular example, although it's not the only example of these themes appearing in a particular place. And remember again that Paul talks about this Lord's Supper, this Last Supper, in his letters which are also circulating before the Jewish war, that would have likely been accessible to the early Christian authors to get an idea that there was a Lord's Supper the night before Jesus died in any event. And so then you can fill in the blanks with other literature. There's another scene in the Satyricon that's traditionally called the Widow of Ephesus. And it's a bit of a salacious scene, just to give you kind of the background. I think I have a couple of minutes here. A widow's in the tomb. Her husband has perished. She's in a tomb with her maid, mourning over the body and crying. Well, right outside the tomb, 3 men have been crucified by the Roman soldiers. And there's a Roman soldier who's been tasked with guarding the body so that no one takes one down off the cross. So he's standing at guard at these 3 crucified bodies, and he hears this weeping, and he sees the maid in the tomb, the woman and her maid in the tomb, lamenting. And he goes in, he tries to comfort her. He orders basically some Uber Eats. They start to relax, drinking, they get full. You can imagine what happens after that. It's a satire. I think the text just says, they fall victim to the thing that tends to happen when your tummy's full and you're happy. So they make love in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. During that time, one of the crucified men, their family comes and takes the body. So the body's disappeared from the cross. And so the widow, now enamored with this Roman soldier, knowing that his penalty will be death should he be found out that one of these bodies has been stolen off the cross, decide to take her husband's body and put that up on the cross instead, in his place, leaving an empty tomb. There is a lot of literature. So that story alone, 3 men crucified, Roman soldier, empty tomb, again, in the Satyricon, lots of themes that we see mirrored in the Gospels. That theme of the empty tomb is all over Greco-Roman literature. In Mark ends with the stone being rolled away from Jesus's tomb at the entrance, and the women flee from the tomb in fear and amazement, and they say nothing to anyone because they're afraid, because they see an apparition and they understand that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they're trying to make sense of the supernatural events that they have witnessed. There's a Greek novel, this is not from the Satyricon, but a Greek novel where you have a very similar story when there are 2 lovers in this story, Chaereas and Callirrhoe. Chaereas goes to the tomb. He sees that the stone has been rolled from the tomb. He goes in and he sees that his beloved's body is missing. So he looks up towards the heavens and he says, which of the gods is it then who's become my love rival and carried off Callirrhoe? Who knew that I had a goddess for a wife? So this idea that when you had an empty tomb, when the stone has been rolled away from the empty tomb, that the person inside, something miraculous, supernatural has happened, or that person has become a god. This was also very common in Greco-Roman literature, whether you're looking at the Satyricon, looking at Caraton's Callirrhoe, or if you're looking at the Gospels. In this period of time, this narrative is quite popular. So I end the book after giving all these different comparisons by talking about how do we then better situate the Gospels in terms of Greco-Roman literature and its genre classification. If I've gone through all this trouble to demonstrate that the Greco-Roman authors are not solely relying on oral tradition, that they are traditional Greco-Roman authors, that they're part of some kind of social, cultural elite, not necessarily of the folk of the ancient Mediterranean, that they are calling upon paideia and quote unquote, filling in the blanks of the gospel story, again, not with oral tradition, but with what else is out there in Greco-Roman literature that we know, if they've been through paideia, they have read, they've engaged, and they know quite well what genre are the gospels. Back to the early Christian Big Bang. If you imagine a Big Bang, the gospels seem idiosyncratic in a very important way, and that there's been nothing like them before. And I'm arguing against that. So I've worked with the classicist David Constant on this question. And I expand on an article or a chapter that we wrote together on civic and subversive biography in antiquity. And I argue that the Gospels are a kind of subversive ancient biography. I won't go back to it now, but that intro that I showed you, that preface that Luke provides, where I mentioned, rhetorically, he says he spoke to eyewitnesses, but he's also demonstrating some kind of literary activity that was very traditional, reading other stories, collating them, coming up with another story. This is what historiographers and biographers in antiquity describe themselves doing all the time. Luke's preface looks very similar to what we see ancient biographers and historiographers put in their own prefaces in the ancient world, describing their own practices. And in a sense, Jesus represents those same kind of biographies, but in a key we see develop in the late 1st century into the 2nd century, and actually elsewhere in Mediterranean literature, but I try to focus it here, where you have a hero, but he gets by not on his brawn or his wealth or his good looks or his strengths, his traditional civic strengths, but he gets by on his wits or his ability to miracle work or his ability to be an excellent philosopher or teacher. And so some of those, the examples that I give are Alexander from the Alexander Romance and Aesop, who's depicted here, who are described as being kind of unattractive, kind of being a very subversive figure, or being somebody that you wouldn't necessarily imagine as a traditional hero. And I think that Jesus fits into this classification for a number of reasons. And one, again, is kind of back to this rhetorical idea. If you're very anti-Roman, Jesus is an excellent foil to the Roman imperial system and to the very Roman imperial world that I'm saying these gospels belong to. the Romans are responsible in part for Jesus's death, and they are basically the big bad bullies who take this poor Galilean peasant and give him the worst death imaginable. But he is, unbeknownst to them, this Jewish Messiah who will come back and have the ultimate vindication for what those people have done, that great imperial giant, those colonizers have done. But if you're pro-Roman, there's something in the Gospels too. And I mean pro-Roman in a very loose sense. Jesus is a teacher of ethics in the Gospels. And many of those ethics mirror the ethics of the Greco-Roman philosophical system of the first century Mediterranean world. He's also clearly embracing the ethos of his time in his depiction of the Roman world, including an interest in things like nativities and miracle working and wonder working in the first century, which was just endemic to the ancient Mediterranean world and all class systems, social systems across the board. Jesus exemplifies all of those qualities in the Gospels. And so to me, it's even more of a reason to read Jesus and the Gospels themselves as Roman literature, and to reconsider the role of the Gospel author as part of more of an elite class and not just a spokesperson for early Christianity. Because I think that all of the evidence we have, again, from a historical standpoint for the development of this literature and what we know about the formation of social groups in the ancient Mediterranean world suggest a much slower process, and one that, for written evidence anyway, suggests a much more elite literate portion of society. I think I can end it there.
Well, thank you very much. I'll remind folks that you can, that if you want to ask questions, you can throw it into the Q&A. We already have a couple, but I'm going to take advantage of my position as the person reading the questions to throw in one of my own.
Okay.
And I'll have to say, it never occurred to me to pair the Satyricon with the Gospels, and yet it's pretty convincing when you throw it out there. Has anybody talked about these similarities before, or is it just such a strange juxtaposition from our traditional views of those two texts that it didn't occur to anybody else either?
It was one of those moments when I first started to compare them. I was on a research trip in a classics library. So I had access to all of these texts, and there's a scholar named Bowersock who had just kind of in passing mentioned, I've seen some of these, the Testamentum. That was the point that he had, where Trimalchio gives his testament. And he had pointed that out, that this seems very similar to the Last Supper. And I just tore that library apart going, why hasn't somebody compared these two? So I wrote an article talking about the Widow of Ephesus and the empty tomb motif and Trimalchio. And I sent it to Classical Quarterly because I thought somebody there will put me in my place. There was one other person, Ilaria Ramelli, had talked about it in an article. So to think after all this time, I could only find two scholars who were talking about this almost in passing. And Classical Quarterly took it right away. And it turns out that a former colleague at the institution that's now housing that journal worked on the Satyricon. So I felt good after that I was in strong position to make these associations, but it worked for trying to situate the Gospels again within the scope of Greco-Roman literature, to say, and I argue this in the article and in the book, it doesn't really matter to me, like I'm never gonna be able to prove the chicken and egg argument, but you can see that these stories are out in the ether. So rather than attribute elements of the Gospels always to oral tradition, what do you do when Paul has already talked about this as a divination experience, not from a historical standpoint, but from a revealed dream? And you have these narratives out there. When you put that together, it suggests to me that there's an alternative to the oral tradition theory.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
There's a follow-up question on that, which I'll sort of skip forward to. David Kling, I think, is trying to nail you down on, you sort of talked about maybe influence going back and forth. So he asked, could the author of Satyricon have borrowed from Mark rather than Mark from the author of the Satyricon?
Yeah, so the the two uncomfortable answers to that are, one thing that I argue in the article is that there's been recent work by a scholar named Ulrike Roth, who has demonstrated that the Satyricon should probably not be attributed to Petronius in the 1st century, but is 2nd century, and has been erroneously attributed, and demonstrates that because there are elements in Pliny's letters that are mirrored in the Satyricon in a way that it seems like it's somebody in Pliny's intellectual circle. If that's the case, this is the same Pliny who is writing to Trajan about Christians that are in Bithynia, and he doesn't know what to do with them. And he's clearly and he's persecuting them. What we might say persecute, that's a strong. He's giving them kind of 1st, 2nd, 3rd chances to just worship the emperor and be normal for the area. And if they're not doing it, he's writing to Trajan saying, the Emperor Trajan saying, I'm murdering them. Is that okay? Or I'm sentencing them to capital punishment. Is that okay? But his description of them is not as a threat, not as a major, again, cohesive or coherent movement. In fact, he talks about, if I give him a 2nd chance, most of them just say, okay, I'll leave the group. And so he's clearly he's not even sure if they're called Christians. He's sort of misinformed about them, but knows enough about them to know that he has to deal with it. So if the author of the Satyricon is somebody in that circle, what if the Satyricon is actually a satire of Christianity? I think that's a really interesting question. So if that's the case, I would say, yes, you have the Widow of Ephesus story. He's taking that from a long tradition of literature, the Satyricon, whoever the author is, and sort of channeling it into one story. So my larger point still stands, which is that these are narratives that are out there. And if you imagine the Gospels not as, and it's the product of an established group trying to record their oral traditions for posterity, but a developing group for whom some kind of elite literate producer has latched on to this narrative and wants to produce a compelling story within genre, they're going to invoke philosophy, known stories, things that will get this thing published and circulated and read, versus, you know, trying to capture the traditions of the folk.
Okay. We had a couple of questions from Jonathan Perry while you were speaking, and we'll see if we have time for both of them, but I'll ask one of them first. And this goes back to your historical roots of biblical or the study of the Bible. He asked, do Ernest Renan's Life of Jesus and the contemporaneous search for the historical Jesus reflect a departure from the Romantic literary tradition in the middle of the 19th century? Renan wanted to see a mustard seed in Palestine for himself, but that may be due more to a realist sensibility than a romantic one?
If I understand this question, oh wait, it disappeared. Hold on a second. I was trying to look at it and it disappeared.
Yes.
I would have to see it again to understand that second part about seeing the Palestinian mustard seed for himself, the realist interpretation, rather than a romantic one. You can look under the
answered questions. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Okay. See a mustard seed in Palestine for himself. Okay, so here I understand realist sensibility actually to be within the vein of what we might call materialism. And in that case, materialism, I think, is a centerpiece of the Romantic project, because even within the Romantic movement, the idea that you can locate in place an attachment to the Geist, to the spirit, it's not exclusive to text. It also pertains to geography. So the idea that you can evoke the spirit of the people through finding particular material objects, material places, that to me is part and parcel of the Romantic project, and in great measure, actually, the work of the historian. She was going to be our Stanford lecturer last year, Sue Marchand. Has influenced me quite a bit. Her book on German Orientalism has influenced me quite a bit on this point, where I see that kind of project actually intrinsically tied to anti-Semitic sentiments that come up within the field of New Testament studies, in particular after the First World War and the Second World War, especially. So I do see it tied to the Romantic project and not separate from it.
By the way, I'm happy to say that Sue Marchand she's coming as a IRG speaker, but she'll be here in March, I think. So
can I meet her?
I certainly hope so.
Because I love her work. I wish I could write something as wonderful as that book.
So Morgan Brown says, can you say a bit about the parables from this perspective?
From the perspective, so that they're meaning that they're not oral tradition or that kind of thing. Many of the parables reflect, I think, interest in Greco-Roman philosophy. There's a scholar named Aaron Roberts who's written quite convincingly on the Gospel of Matthew, for example, as being imbued in Stoic philosophy. And I also think that many of those teachings are reflected in some Pythagorean documents, including the Pythagorean golden verses, which are also being developed in this period long after Pythagoras himself, who are also what we might call competitors for the early Christian leadership groups that are starting to develop around the Mediterranean world, particularly in the East. But I think many of the parables do reflect Greco-Roman sentiments. That's why I was emphasizing Greco-Roman ethics a little bit in the talk, that Jesus is sort of the ideal Greco-Roman philosopher, in actually the vein that you also see Paul advocating for in his letters, his understanding of the importance of the figure of Christ and what it means to actually share in what we would call the spirit of Christ if you become a member of this group.
Simon Evaney says, I think I asked you this before, but are you suggesting that the authors of the Gospels didn't belong to the Jesus movement? But Luke's intro says the events that happened among us. So
I think, yeah, they probably heard this somewhere. They realized this was fertile ground somehow. I'm not going to be, someone who tries to just go the complete opposite direction and say that, well, there are no Christians and that these people are not allied in some measure to a movement we might call Christianity. Luke, generally speaking, is thought to be written somewhere around 80 or 90, these dates, what can I say about them? We're guesstimating the best we can, but certainly written after Mark. By the time you get to Luke, who seems very reliant on the letters of Paul, if not himself sort of a Paulinist, you have some kind of cohesive group. Now, he's very reliant on the Gospel of Mark. Does Mark know anybody who's part of a Jesus group? The ecclesia or groups that he imagines in the text seem to be much more aspirational or sort of utopian than maybe actual. And the Gospel of Luke is much more esoteric. The Gospel of Mark is much more esoteric and sort of disjointed than the other Gospels, in the sense that I had my dissertation advisor once, Stanley Stowers, once said, you should read the Gospel of Mark with the Twilight Zone theme song in your head, because Jesus very much is, he's here, and then he's here, and then he's here. The narrative is trying to do something else that I think has been not appreciated for its literary art. In the way that maybe it should be. It is doing some really interesting and creative things with the way that it imagines Middle Platonic philosophy, which is why I was mentioning Philo earlier. So this is something that we also see elsewhere in the Greco-Roman region among those who are, allied to Jewish practices and literature as well. So I think with Mark, you can make the argument, maybe he's aware of this, but he's maybe dabbling. Or has maybe read, a few letters of Paul and is trying his hand at one of these subversive biographies. I could see a universe in which you make that argument. By the time you get to Luke, and particularly if you are of the opinion that the author of Luke also authored Acts, by the time you get to Acts with its, spontaneous conversion stories and that kind of thing, I think you definitely have what we might call Christians.
I have another question that sort of came in indirectly, and the question itself is, what is your take on the gospel as eyewitness accounts, either written or dictated by the individuals who are witnesses to the life of Christ? I think you sort of implicitly, by taking the kind of scholarly dating of the gospels as being at least a couple of generations later, you're saying it's not an eyewitness, but maybe you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on the oral tradition. You say you don't want to throw it away completely. Do you think there's reliable material that's passed down, or not sure?
I just don't know how I would know where it is. To some extent, you could say the methods that I've deployed here, you could try to extract the elements you think are from broader Greco-Roman literature and then see what's left. And then you have something like the Jesus seminar that tries to vote on, which of these sayings are legitimately Jesus's, how word for word do you think they are, etc. My question is always what's at stake in trying to do that. Because I'm not sure we're doing that for any other ancient texts or authors in the exact same way. So you have to be transparent about your interest in trying to reconstruct a history from these kinds of texts in that way that I see as chiefly literary. And certainly we do this in different degrees all the time. I'm not very good at reading these questions while I'm talking, but I did see one about, well, you have Herodotus and Thucydides, where do you locate the gospel authors relative to historians like these. And the thing is, we understand the efforts of those kinds of authors to be rhetorical. So even, again, the idea of an eyewitness, Herodotus cites eyewitnesses all the time, but then he says something that we know is just so not historical or makes no sense that, as scholars, we just go, and we have no problem doing that with Herodotus. But we do seem to have difficulty letting go when it comes to the Gospels. But I would just encourage us to recognize the extent to which the Gospels look very much like traditional Greco-Roman literature, if what you have at stake is simply classifying them as literary documents. So, I mentioned the work of Kirk, who won the MacArthur Prize for her book on it was Synoptic Conversations was the name of the book. And I actually talk about the book a bit. I think she may have fallen into the romantic trap to some degree in trying to reconstruct oral tradition. But I also don't see too much harm in sharpening our theoretical knives or scissors as we start to try to extract from these texts what we can to try to understand the social fabric of the ancient Mediterranean world.
I'll do one last question. We're a bit past 9, but Nicholas Patricios asks, why did the Jesus movement produce written text but not other movements of the time, e.g. Mithras? I'll add to that. I'm wondering if maybe there are scraps from other movements in papyri that just haven't been preserved because the movements didn't survive.
Well, we're always victim to what is extant. And certainly because of the way that Christianity, we're still practicing the religion, managed to take root, those texts were chiefly preserved. Now, what we do have from groups like Mithras may not be the kinds of stories that you're talking about. And that could be also a victim of who tended to be part of Mithraea, which are the Roman army, who were, some were literate, some would retire to Spain and write their, autobiographies. But that might be a function of that. So you're actually kind of helping my case with that question. So I appreciate that. Because yes, the people who are writing these things down must be in a position to write them down. And so perhaps those who are part of the Mithraic cults, we might call them, were not in a position to do that. But what survived are their assembly rolls. So we know how their membership worked. We know how many members were in them. We know what they ate when they had fellowship meals. We know what they charged to be part of the group. And we know this, there's a recent book by John Kloppenborg called Christ Assemblies, where he actually compares, because what we don't have from early Christianity are any evidence of groups, except for the aspirational utopian kind that you find in literature. Or references from Pliny, to individuals he's dragging in. We don't really have, and Paul, who has these loosely, collated people who are, not listening to him, and he's getting frustrated. What you don't have are the buildings, the art, the other kinds of production, material production, or evidence of intergroup sort of organization that you have actually abundant evidence for, who are calling themselves, by the way, ecclesia, the word that we translate in Greek as church. So we have multiple other religions with groups that are cohesive and bounded with, like, rules about who can sit where, and those survive. But for Christianity, we just have stories.
Well, thanks. And I think the rest of there's a couple more questions, but I think they've been answered. And in any case, we are past 9. So as I so often say, the one real disadvantage of this kind of setup is the audience can't applaud as they would normally. So I'll applaud wildly for them. And
Thank you.
thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and thank the audience for coming, and hope that you will come to future events, and finish up with thanking you once again, Robyn, for a really fantastic talk. And
thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you again, Justin,
pleasure.
for that lovely intro.